Okay, so moving back to agency now, from distributorship, the thing that strikes terror into most brands' hearts is the possibility of the agent being paid an indemnity or compensation on termination, big payments. Now, let's look first at when the entitlement to indemnity or compensation arises. Well, the entitlement only arises on the termination of the agency agreement. Now, the most obvious example of termination is, say, when you give the agent 3 months' notice of termination. But termination also includes other scenarios which you might not expect to give rise to a claim on the agent's part for indemnity or compensation. And these include if a fixed term agreement expires, the retirement through age of an agent or retirement because of illness or injury, the death of the agent, or the assignment of the agency agreement. So say if the brand sells its business and as a result of that the agency agreement is assigned to another party, then these will all be terminations which give rise to a right to, on the agent's part to claim indemnity or compensation. Now, it often comes as a surprise to fashion brands that agents can claim in these circumstances, because there isn't any issue of fault. But please keep this exposure in mind if your agents, for example, are on fixed term agreements which are nearing their end, or if your agents, as Rachel said earlier, are sort of 63, 64, coming up to what was the old style retirement age, or if they're in very ill health. You may have a sort of liability which is just around the corner. There are some cases where the agency agreement will be terminated but an entitlement won't arise on the agent's part to an indemnity or compensation. And these were the situations set out in Regulation 18 of the regulations, which Rachel spoke about in her last talk. Now, the final point on the slide there is that the agent has to notify the principal within a year of termination of its intention to claim an indemnity or compensation. Now, if an agent doesn't do this, it loses its right to claim an indemnity or compensation, so this is hugely important. Nothing particularly formal is required from the agent here, just something usually in writing for evidential purposes, saying that they intend to claim under Regulation 17 of the regulations, which is the regulation which governs indemnity and compensation. And in practice, most agents do claim very quickly following termination, but it's always worth checking if an agent crawls out of the woodwork several months after termination whether they have actually complied with this, because if they haven't notified you within the year of their intention to claim, and then they try to assert a claim a year and a half down the line, then it's an easy win for you. Now, I'm going to talk about indemnity, and the slide I just went through was the actual entitlement to indemnity or compensation, depending on which the agent is entitled to, and which the agent will be entitled to will be dependent on the agency agreement. If the principal has agreed in the agency agreement for an indemnity to be paid, then the agent will be entitled to indemnity. If the agency agreement is silent, or there's no written agreement, then the agent will be entitled to compensation. But just to concentrate on indemnity, the regulations implement the European Agency Directive, and the European Commission published a report in 1996 which considered that the directive laid down a four-stage process in assessing the amount of indemnity, which is as follows. The first issue is to consider whether the entitlement to an indemnity has been lost by the agent, and that's going back to Regulation 18. Has the agent committed a material breach as a result of which the principal is terminated, or has the agent just resigned and not resigned because of age or illness, or because of something that the fashion brand has done, but just resigned, in which case they won't be entitled to an indemnity. Secondly, consider whether the agent has introduced new customers or whether he has significantly increased the volume of business done with existing customers. And I'll examine in a moment what that actually means and the sort of significance of that. Thirdly, consider whether the principal continues after the end of the agency agreement to derive substantial benefits with such customers, and again I'll go through that in a moment. And fourth, the payment of the indemnity must be equitable and it must be fair. Now most brands will say, well, payment of an indemnity is never fair, certainly not on you, but there are various factors which need to be considered as to whether any sort of reduction, the equitable factors, could be taken into account, which would obviously benefit the brand, because the more that you can reduce the indemnity payment, the better. Right, the starting point for calculation is the last 12 months of commission. Now, the regulations provide that an agent's only entitled to indemnity payment if and to the extent that he has bought the principal new customers or has significantly increased the volume of business with existing customers. So what does this mean? Well, new customers, it's quite obvious. These are customers which the agent has at some point introduced to the brand. Existing customers where there has been a significant increase in business. What is meant here? I mean, these are customers which the agent has inherited at the start of the agency, the customers which you give the agent when he takes the actual territory on. But what's a significant increase in business? Well, there's nothing in English law to help us on this point, but the indemnity system is based on German law, so the European Commission does tell us that we should be looking to German law for any help or guidance that any of the other member states need as to how to calculate an indemnity. And German law says that a significant increase in business is somewhere close to a doubling in the volume of business done. And then the percentage will vary depending on the industry and depending on the circumstances. But the point is that the existing customer should only be taken into account for the purpose of your indemnity calculation if the business from that existing customer has been grown so much that it's the equivalent to you having gained a new customer. So it can be seen from that the indemnity system is concerned with rewarding the agent for the added value that the agent has brought to the principal's brand. The new business that the agent has been responsible for winning, whether that business is because of a new customer, actual new customer, or whether that new business is in the form of a substantial increase of the business done with an existing customer. And what this means in practice is that when you're actually calculating your indemnity payment, you can exclude automatically from the indemnity calculation any commission earned on sales to customers which were not either new customers or existing customers where the volume of business has been substantially increased. So basically, if you've got existing customers that have been given to the agent at the beginning of the agency agreement, where there hasn't been a substantial increase in business, there hasn't been effectively a doubling or close to a doubling in business, then they can be excluded from the indemnity calculation. So you can see that you can cut down, automatically reduce your indemnity payment by discounting any sales made in the last 12 months to those customers. And it's important to note that this differentiation between business bought by the agent and that given to the agent doesn't apply to the compensation system. So this is only with indemnity. So this is one of the reasons why we advise brands to opt for an indemnity. And there's another reason, which I'll come on to later, but it's because there are ways of reducing the payment made. And in a way you can see that the indemnity system actually punishes weaker agents. The weaker agents who haven't introduced many accounts and who haven't really grown existing business will be punished by the indemnity system. Right, moving on to other conditions for an indemnity to apply. The regulations require that for an indemnity to be payable, the principal has to continue to derive benefit from the business generated by the agent. So if when the agency agreement comes to an end, a customer is likely to stop doing business with the principal because of that, then the commission earned on sales to that customer can be excluded from the indemnity calculation. The idea behind the indemnity system is that when the principal terminates the agency contract, he will continue in most circumstances to benefit from the business that the agent has generated during the agency agreement, but he won't have to pay any commission on that to the agent. So the indemnity payment is a way of redressing the balance and compensating the agent who's lost his agency for the commission that he would otherwise have earned on future sales to the customers which he either introduced or substantially grew. And then finally we come on to this requirement that the payment must be equitable. It must be fair. Well, the European Commission has said that the following points can be taken into account when assessing whether the payment is fair. Any fault of the agent, which results in termination. Now remember, if the principal terminates as a result of the material breach, which Rachel spoke of earlier, of the agent, then the principal has a good argument for not paying any compensation or indemnity at all. But if the principal terminates for a lesser breach that the agent has committed, which doesn't give it the right to terminate with immediate effect but is still a breach, then that may be able to be taken into account in the indemnity calculation. Another factor which can be taken into account is whether the agent has lost any other contractual benefits other than commission from losing his agency. If he has, then obviously he'll be able to argue for a higher indemnity to be paid. And the existence of a restrictive covenant clause in the agency agreement will be relevant as an equitable factor on the basis that if the agent is subject to a restrictive covenant requiring that he doesn't work within the specific region for another fashion brand in a particular sector for 6 months, say, then the indemnity he's paid is likely to be higher because he's being kept out of the market. Now, in German case law, there have been reductions to indemnity payments for equitable factors on the basis of trademark suction, where the brand sells itself and its success is not attributable to the work of the agent, but actually the strength of the brand. Arguing trademark suction is something that we often like to do when acting for principals. But it is difficult for smaller or less well-known brands. The actual German cases where trademark suction was taken into account and reductions were made to the indemnity payment payable were cases involving large car manufacturers, household names essentially. And just a further word of caution generally on the equitable reduction argument. When negotiating indemnity payments, and when acting for fashion brands, we do say that various reductions should be made to the indemnity payment to be paid to the agent for equitable factors. But in practice, it's doubtful whether a court would make the same reductions. So you do have to be careful. You can't just whack off 50%, because of something you say is an equitable factor. So you can't just say, oh, the brand is so successful it sells itself, so therefore 50% off. It won't work like that if you go to a court. And final points on indemnity. Something I haven't mentioned yet, which is a critical difference between indemnity and compensation, is that indemnity is capped. Now, the maximum payable to the agent by way of an indemnity will be 1 year's commission based on the agent's average annual commission over the preceding 5 years, or if the agency has been in place for a shorter term than 5 years, however long the agency has been in place. So it's the average. The cap is not, as many agents would have you believe, the automatic amount payable, but it's rather a final corrective after calculating an amount in accordance with a formula which is provided by the European Commission. In the report I referred to earlier, there's a formula set out by the European Commission, which I haven't really got time to go through here, and also it depends very much on circumstances and facts. But the actual cap slots in at the end, and if the amount that you calculated is higher, then the cap will bring that down. And the fact that the indemnity is capped is one of the reasons why we advise brands to opt for indemnity in their written agreements, and you do actually have to specifically opt for it. A principal who opts for an indemnity will be able to calculate at any given time what his exposure, his maximum exposure is to the agent by way of indemnity, and you can't do that for compensation. So, that peace of mind is very valuable. And then one final point on the slide is often ignored in Regulation 17 is that the agent who claims an indemnity payment can also claim damages. It's difficult to envisage a circumstance where that might arise, and we've certainly not seen it, but it is there. So that has to be borne in mind.